Teresa Strong. I'm Director of Research Programs at the Foundation for Prader Willi Research. I really appreciate everybody joining us this afternoon to talk about real-world data. This webinar, we hope, will be an informative and interactive webinar in which you learn a little bit about real-world data research. And we take the opportunity to have your thoughts and input on how we can best use these technologies, these new technologies, to understand PWS and to facilitate clinical trials. So this webinar and a workshop that we held a couple of months ago are partially funded from a grant from PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. PCORI is a national granting organization with the mission to fund research that centers on the patient and to help patients choose healthcare options that are best for them. So our goal here is to include the patient voice and in the process of developing the real-world data applications for PWS. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Jessica Bohanowicz, who is our Associate Director of Research Programs and who will be driving the webinar and managing it. As well, we have Chris Jones, who is has developed, among other things, I Take Control. Chris has been in the rare disease space for more than 20 years and in health technology and marketing. He's focused on using digital technology to develop research tools that are very responsive to the patient. We're also joined by Brent Clough, who is the co-founder and CEO of Trio Health. And Trio Health is focused on ways to use medical record information to improve the quality of care for patients. So we'll be hearing from both Chris and Brent about different aspects of real-world data. Jessica will talk with us a little bit about some of the findings from the workshop that we held at the FPWR conference in the fall, and then we'll be asking you for your input on how we can use real-world data for PWS. So Jessica, if you would, on the next slide, these are what we hope are some questions that you'll be thinking about as you listen to Brent and as we listen to Brent and Chris. So some of the questions we're hoping you'll think about are, what are the research questions that are of highest priority to the PWS community? Have we missed any opportunities where we can use some devices or technologies to capture data from PWS? And what are the feasibility, what are the challenges we're going to face in using technology to capture data from PWS? And do you have any concerns or questions about using this technology to advance PWS research? So we'll ask you to be thinking about those issues, and if you have questions that come up during the presentation, if you can just type them into the chat box at the end of the discussion, at the end of the slides, presentations, Jessica will bring those up for discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Jessica and let us get on our way.
So we're going to start off, thank you, Teresa. We're going to start off with Chris Jones. And as Teresa mentioned, Chris was one of the panelists that presented at the in-person aspect of this workshop, which was held in Rhode Island during the family conference in the fall. And he is going to present a little bit about just sort of the scope of what real-world data is to give everybody in the webinar some background information as we move forward. Chris?
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. As Jessica said, I'll try and maybe do have a little bit of a survey, an informal survey of what I think about when we talk about real-world data. As Jessica said, I've worked in a variety of different projects in real-world, including registries and patient-reported instruments and registry designs and so forth. So maybe I'll sort of pick and choose from some of the concepts and many of you may be familiar with clinical trial research, or you may be new to thinking about research design. So hopefully this maybe gives some context to the discussion today. So let's go ahead and advance. I think in the rare disease space, I really think about it as, you know, a challenge of putting together a story about a particular disease and the knowledge there over time. So you might start with like one small image or data set and you just keep forwarding here, Jessica, and then you add into the picture, but it might not be coordinated. It may appear unrelated, and you're hoping to speed the process so you can understand what's happening with the disease until a picture emerges. So that's some of the, I know with some of the diseases that I have worked in and helped with projects, depending on the amount of literature, the amount of studies, the understanding of the natural course of the disease, the effective treatments, there could be a whole host of questions, and you know, trying to speed this is obviously, I think, what all of us try and work on with various types of studies, and we'll talk a little bit about how real-world data might be able to play a part in this picture in addition to clinical trials. So next slide. So, you know, thinking about real-world evidence or real-world data, I happen to be, as Jessica was mentioning, we were at the Rhode Island session. It was Sunday morning, I think, so I was using the example of coffee and caffeine, and you know, it's accepted that it's a stimulant and makes people feel awake, right? A generalization. I think I was talking that morning about, you know, for me, it makes me feel like jittery or anxious. So it's not so much a positive thing. So, you know, how do we all respond differently to different, you know, variables, right? So how I respond to one person, it's an anecdote. How do we generalize that experience? How do we study it? How do we arrive at scientific consensus? I'm kind of following almost a little bit of a trail there in those concepts of starting with an anecdote or a hypothesis, right, and then designing trials, and then hopefully over time gaining some understanding. And where does real-world data fit in that understanding, really, from, let's say, a single case presented to a single physician or a single patient experience, and then how that gets generalized. So where does real-world data fit in this flow of evidence? Next slide. Anecdotal, so starting with anecdotal evidence. This is an article pulled from The Onion, if some of you may know that. Anecdotal evidence reliable? One man says yes. This is, you know, this is the problem that you may all deal with, whether it's in Prader Willi or, you know, other health issues, or just generally where something happens to one person and you really want to know whether that's something that's happening to others, right? And you can look at social media, or you can look at comparing how you respond to certain variables with other people. And I'm actually working on a project right now where, you know, the patient community participated in the FDA advisory panel, and the anecdotal evidence, so-called, was, you know, very much part of the discussion with the patient experience, and quantifying those anecdotes is really part of the world of patient-reported outcomes, or it could be part of real-world data collection, and we'll talk about some examples. So next slide. Looking at maybe group understanding as opposed to one person, right? This happens to be a shot. I used to live along the south coast here in Massachusetts, and you could see starlings flying in patterns, right? Much like a school of fish, right? How does one person know, or one bird or fish know where to go, right? They just are turning left and right together in unison almost, and it's really kind of amazing to watch. I think this snapshot is actually from YouTube. If you want some fun to distract you from a snowstorm in the Northeast, if you happen to be in the Northeast, you can look at starlings flying. It's pretty cool. So the scientific process is about getting out of these kind of coming to some reasoned, rational, evidence-based ways of knowing where we're going, right? And if we should go left or right and what it means. So that's related to real-world data because obviously, as we all maybe contribute to a project, whether it's through a mobile app or through a registry, if you know about the Prader Willi registry, for example, you're trying to collect evidence from multiple standpoints to figure out what the experience is in the community. So next slide. So in kind of the medical world, right, or the scientific world, this is kind of the traditional model, right? You might have a case study published, but if others start to see or observe similar repetition, right, then you can test a specific variable, and repeatable results is obviously a big thing in the science and in the sciences of medicine. And if you can repeat results often enough, you can also come up to the standard of having some treatment guidelines or consensus on how to manage things. So going to the next slide. In that process, right, a randomized controlled trial, which is very much the accepted gold standard, or whatever phrase you want to use about how to develop evidence, right? It's obviously a well-proven model for doing science. It comes with a controlled environment to kind of remove all the different external variables. You're trying to get bias or other things that don't have to do with what you're testing out of the way. You're trying to reduce all the factors that could be unpredictable, and you're trying to observe change against a specific hypothesis. Next slide. So going back to this picture that I started with, a study might be one of these boxes, right, where you have a specific variable, and you can go ahead and finish the animation, Jessica. So, a study might represent, one of the boxes to generate a knowledge about a specific variable, but especially in rare diseases where the research can be limited, or there just hasn't been a lot of study, there's still a lot of questions beyond, let's say, the preclinical animal research or the phase 1, 2, and 3 of what a company might do to develop a therapy. And this is where some real-world registries, natural history studies, community efforts to look at what's happening, let's say, on social media, all of those different inputs are important. And the trick is to figure out how we can use them as evidence with, let's say, the FDA or regulatory authorities, or for publication, so they're not just anecdotes. So next slide. So in the real-world data, right, it's kind of the opposite of the clinical trial environment, right? It's more of an uncontrolled setting, right? There's no structure or design necessarily out in the jungle, if you will, using the image I have up. There could be many variables affecting things. There could be different biases or experiences, different levels of unpredictability, system changes. So all of that is a factor in designing studies for real world, or designing technology or applications that might collect data. We still have to think about how we can analyze it and how it would fit into the body of knowledge around other more tightly controlled studies, if I can say it that way. So let's think about different types of data and different types of evidence. We happen to be in Rhode Island, as Teresa and Jessica were mentioning, so I just pulled this graphic on the left from the hours, that chart, that bar chart down at the bottom of hours of, and I'm sure you've seen this on your Google searches, right? This is passive data just generated from, data, Google, observations of your cell phone, aggregate cell phone data and population behavior, right? Essentially looking at how many people are going to the mall on a Sunday. And so that's kind of passive data. again, you're just observing what's happening, and then trying to collect data to learn what the patterns might be. On the other side, I've just grabbed a snapshot of any number of the food or nutrition apps that are out there. You could be doing something sort of prospectively, right? Entering data along certain categories that are important to you, whether it's your meals or so forth. So different types of data, different types of designs. So, looking at kind of a definition maybe for the discussion, looking at researching change over time, right, in real-world settings, right? Could be a home or in the physician practices in the clinic or other, quote, field settings. So you're basically, like the, whether you're using prospective tools or retrospective tools to generate data, you're trying to look at those patterns that emerge outside, patterns that emerge out of the data, I guess, to simplify it, as opposed to maybe setting up a controlled trial. Now, you can still set up trials and designs and analysis of the data. Here's a couple of examples of setting up types of studies, observational studies of a product or a disease. You may be familiar with a registry, for example. Longitudinal studies that look at change over time on specific parameters. The difference being with those kind of designs, if you think of a clinical trial testing, let's say a placebo-controlled trial where you're testing a population that's on placebo versus another population with an intervention or a therapy, and setting, let's say, a time window to that, let's say 2 years. Maybe in an observational or longitudinal study, you might be gathering data over 5-10 years. And you're not necessarily on the outset prescribing that one group get placebo and another group get treatment. You are looking at data from all of those comers, so to speak. So I'm going to move on for sake of time here, Jessica. So I just pulled a couple of examples here. This is from a project I worked on. I happened to work at Genzyme for about 10 years, and we did a patient-reported survey in Europe with one of the leading centers there. And this was kind of the life cycle of generating the experience of Pompe disease patients. So the early publications or the early data that was generated was more about the manifestations or the natural history of the disease. As treatment was introduced, you looked at more treatment outcomes questions on who was responding, maybe dose response, or how it was changing the course of the disease for those that were on treatment. And then in the long term, as they started to get towards 10 years of data, they started to look at the outcomes of treatment itself on survival, quality of life, and so that's just one example of maybe how a patient-reported survey, and I would qualify it as real-world in the sense that all of this happened around and after the clinical trials that set up the therapy for approval. So you're essentially looking at what's happening out there beyond the approval trials. Next slide. Another example that I pulled is in aging. So this was a study that looked at generating home data with using instruments basically to observe patterns of motion in houses where Alzheimer's patients or other aging populations opted in to do this study and to participate and to look at the patterns. So, for example, walking speed or mobility patterns or their use of a keyboard could all be observed and generate data to look at differences in the patterns. Next slide. The reason they looked at doing sort of a home-based monitoring were questions like these, and just for sake of time, for example, what happens to a patient when they're not in my office from a physician's perspective, right? Or from a research perspective. That's a big issue in many diseases, many chronic diseases, where you just really have a snapshot when you're in the office getting your assessments or labs or whatever it might be. So in Alzheimer's, these were similar problems. So going to the next slide here, Jessica. This is a pattern of movement of an Alzheimer patient in their house, and different colors represent different rooms. And you can see, for example, from about the 10, 11 o'clock period on the screen over to the 4 o'clock near the 8 a.m. thing on this wheel. That's nighttime. So basically motion with more white space, less motion, more sleeping. So next slide. Now this is a comparison of the same sort of monitoring between rooms at different periods of time, and you can see a healthy person was sleeping more in the left-hand wheel. In this case, they were studying Parkinson's, and you see a diagnosis was made about a year later, a lot less sleeping. So all the red in the upper quadrant of the circle there, and then on the far right-hand side, they were comparing treatment. So just another example of actual, real-world outside the clinic data generated from monitoring. And similar, I'm sure you've all kind of heard about or may use things like Fitbits or Garmin or various wearables and how they're generating data that can track your steps and all of that. So that's a whole body of work happening in that sense of real-world monitoring and generating data to see what changes in health. Next slide. So here's just an example. This happens to be a project that I was working on, the IT Control project. This on the left-hand side is more of a traditional survey that you might fill out. Quality of life instrument. A lot of researchers know the SF-36, as it's referred to, 36 questions that measure your quality of life, and you might fill that out in a clinical trial or a registry or some other event whenever you, or some other study I meant, whenever you go into a clinic or have a visit. Maybe it's every 6 months or once a year, and then you can look at change over time on how you answered those questions. It's a very accepted instrument, and it generates validated data. On the right side is just another approach, more in context. This application happened to be looking at binge eating disorder and eating disorder behavior. And the only point I was trying to make here is that the mobile world and mobile apps and wearables are trying to fill in that gap of what happens between the every 6-month visit when you might fill out the survey on the left. This is a did you binge today, yes or no, right? And then, was it yesterday, or you get a date, or what was your urge, or whatever contextual information can be generated from a mobile app or from a wearable. So basically, again, trying to fill in the picture. So Jessica, I'll just do a time check. I had maybe one other slide or a couple slides I could jump to towards the end about the FDA and development of patient-reported outcomes. I think I'll just maybe skip to those. Yeah, let's stop on that one right there, that chart. I just wanted to kind of finish off with the concept here as you think about real-world data, or you may be helping the community design tools that fit Prader Willi, and the community can be dealing with everything from the research foundation or academic or industry-sponsored work. Real-world data kind of falls on a spectrum. You can really look at doing faster data and again filling in that picture that I mentioned. But the quality may not be the same as a totally regulatory driven randomized controlled trial in terms of what the FDA might accept. So it doesn't mean necessarily the real world data doesn't have meaning, but it needs to be put in context. So there's a little bit of a dilemma, right? You can get data fast. You can just use an easy example. I mean, you can go and put up a survey from a web-based tool and collect what a community feels about a certain topic. But that wouldn't necessarily hold the same weight as in terms of evidence as maybe the clinical trial where you're designing a certain study for a certain reason with a certain time period and looking at certain variables. So again, it's more to fitting the tool to the goal of the research, and that's a lot of the design work that people like Teresa and Jessica would put into. Let's say, what would you do with the registry data, or which grants come into play for Prader Willi and how to fund them, and which tools fit goals that need to be addressed to fill in the gaps in the understanding. So I think I'll just stop there. I mean, we could talk a little bit more about how the FDA looked at the development of these instruments, but I want to make sure we got time for Brent and your questions. So Jessica, I guess back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. So Chris sort of spoke to us a little bit about the real-world data with respect to data we might collect while we're at home through wearable devices or apps, software applications. There's a whole other wealth of data that's out there in electronic records, things like electronic health records and insurance records, and there's a lot of information there just with regards to the idea of for example, a prescription that is written may not necessarily be filled, and a prescription that's filled with certain instructions may not necessarily be how somebody uses it in their own home. And so there's also a whole wealth of information out there with regards to real-world data in electronic records and insurance records. And Brent is going to speak with us a little bit about that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Do you want to just go up to the first slide? So thanks, everyone. My name is Brian Clough. I'm CEO of Trio Health, and I thought today what I'd spend 10 minutes or maybe 15 minutes is just walk you through in terms of kind of our approach to real-world evidence in terms of collecting data, and also use hepatitis C just as a case example. But if we take a step back, I think probably the most important advice or things that I've seen in terms of being in this business is really making sure that organizations or people that are focused on RWE is that they really think up front in advance in terms of what are the questions they have, what are the issues that they're trying to understand, so that now when you start to think about what kind of data collection you're going to overlay in terms of in the real world, it aligns with obviously in terms of what your end goals are. So just in terms of just a quick way that we approach this, again, our mission starts and ends with the patient, and our view is that what we need to first do is understand what is going on with real-world patients, and once we understand what's going on with real-world patients, obviously the goal is to then turn around and optimize real-world care. If you want to just go to the next slide. These are some of the business principles, so it's a little different because we are dealing with drugs that have been approved by the FDA. We focus in terms of looking at disease state, not a particular manufacturer, and I won't go through and belabor a lot of things, but I will tell you the probably most important thing that you want to focus on is in terms of that independence and high integrity, because again, that's what's going to drive your ultimate success. You go to the next slide. So when we think about real-world evidence, we focus really on two dimensions. One is we look at, from a clinical point of view, what are the clinical questions and what is the clinical data that we need to collect to better understand the performance of real-world patients. Trio Health is a technology and analytics company, so if we sat down and hepatitis C as a disease state or MS or even a rare disease, no one would care about who Trio Health is. And so what we do is for every disease state that we focus on, we put together a scientific steering committee that's comprised of key opinion leaders that really are the who's who within the industry, meaning they have the respect of their peers, they have the respect of the different manufacturers, and they're obviously highly regarded, and they've obviously published extensively in that particular disease state. We also go with the principle that 8 brains are smarter than 1, and so having diversified talent as part of that steering committee is critically important, as well as it just creates further awareness and obviously depth in terms of just kind of intellectual knowledge as well as scar tissue that these guys all bring to the table for the scientific steering committee. So when we think about the first leg of the stool, really it's the clinical part and what is the questions, the clinical questions, and what is the clinical data that we need to collect to try to better understand and answer those questions. You go to the next slide. Our output is obviously, once we collect all this data, is we really try to focus on 3 things: awareness, accountability, and advocacy. And as I said, we've developed some proprietary technology that allows us to collect data very quickly from EMRs as well as specialty pharmacy data, and also bring in that PHI and collect and combine it so that as a patient, I know your dispensing information, plus I know your lab value, plus your baseline data, comorbids, co-infections, and so forth. And then what we also do is we can obviously track that patient through the duration of therapy. If it's acute, like hepatitis C, or it could be chronic in terms of like an MS or RA or some other type of diseases. The other part that's specific to us, which is not necessarily applicable to PWS, is really accountability and trying to understand how the stakeholders perform and impact the performance of a patient. Because we know that all physicians don't perform at the same level, nor do pharmacies perform. So what we do in addition is we audit each stakeholder and measure how they impact that patient. And then the awareness is really derived from developing a global publication strategy in the case of hepatitis C. Again, where Trio Health is powering it, but it's actually the scientific steering committee that are the lead investigators or the authors of all these studies. And what's unique for us is that we look at all dimensions of a disease, so it's not just for a particular manufacturer or a particular cohort of patient. Can you go to the next slide? And what's interesting, keep going. So I think as what's already been touched upon, obviously in the real world, it's heterogeneous population. It's not this nice, perfect, homogenized population in a clinical trial. But actually, that's the real world, and more importantly, it's actually far more important to understand what the performance of drugs and the performance of patients in the real world versus a clinical trial. Next slide. So again, just to give you kind of a background that's applicable or that's relevant in terms of, so in hepatitis C, the drugs that have been approved are highly efficacious, highly safe, and highly tolerable. And so our goal was to go out and prove to the world that these new drugs, the efficacy and tolerability and safety mimic that of a phase 3 trial. And so we published extensively around the safety, the efficacy, and tolerability of these drugs from all different types of patient cohorts and so forth. But the real issue, if you go to the next slide, that we started to look at was really now from the dimension of a patient. So as you guys know all too well from the patient perspective and thinking about patient-reported outcomes and quality of life, what were the issues confronting hepatitis C patients? And what was unique about hepatitis C is a little bit of situational irony, which is that these manufacturers, Gilead, AbbVie, and Merck, came out with transformational drugs that basically had cure rates of 95% with only 8 to 12 weeks of therapy with virtually no side effects. Yet, if you go to the next slide, what was crazy is that what we found was this, I'll just call it outright discrimination or denial of care to qualified patients that should receive this therapy. So if you now change gears and say this is that we've come up with a cure to cancer, meaning that you take 1 pill a day for 8 weeks and you got a 95% chance of being cured of cancer, what's outrageous is that hepatitis C patients were actually denied access. And restrictions and denials went from 8% in 2014 to most recently 30% in 2016. And the payers have basically imposed all these restrictions. And so as Trio Health, supporting real-world evidence and real-world patients, our goal was not to just publish the clinical side of it, but also to publish it from the patient perspective. And if you go to the next couple of slides, or next slide, let's keep going. So I'll go through this real quickly. So What in the real world, what we saw in terms of what manufacturers were reporting was a decline in demand of new starts, meaning that new starts were going down where it peaked in 2015. But the reality, what we uncovered was that it actually was not reflective of demand, because demand is really focused between starts plus non-starts equal demand. What we also saw was this disconnect around access to care, and that these drugs are super expensive, but the reality is that once you got into the weeds and got behind in terms of understanding all the rebates and discounts, these drugs are actually incredibly cheap. And then there's a whole bunch of healthcare policy that we also started to focus on in terms of both at a state level with Medicaid, in terms of seeing just outright discrimination and inconsistencies relative to commercial payers and Medicare. And so from our perspective, having real-world evidence was very powerful versus, you know, one person standing up and saying in, you know, Texas Medicaid that I was denied access to this drug. And so it's far more powerful and far more effective, again, to start at the very beginning and think about what are the issues confronting your patients, what are the issues on the clinical side, and how do we best address them, and how do we develop a system to collect that information in a way that is going to maximize in terms of the awareness, and obviously trying to advance the ball in particular to, you know, that disease state. So in terms of non-starts, we looked at in terms of based on the different types of payers where the non-start rate was, and clearly you can see that the problem has only gotten worse, and where the real issue has come in most recent is the huge increase in terms of commercial denials, in terms of commercial payers not granting access to these drugs. Can you go to the next slide? When you combine it, right, the picture was that everyone thought that the demand that we treated all these hepatitis C patients, but in reality, it was the denials that doubled between 2015 and 2016 that suppressed suppressed the starts. So actual starts in the United States went from 256,000 to 211,000. But again, Trio Health, because of the way we collected the data, we were the only one to actually evaluate what were the non-starts. And when you add the non-starts and the starts, the demand obviously was still going up, which makes sense given that these are highly efficacious, safe drugs to eradicate hepatitis C. Next slide. The biggest issue, and I think everyone fights in rare diseases in terms of misconceptions, misperceptions, how do we create awareness, what really is going on, and so forth. And this is also what happened in hepatitis C, where the media was focusing on cost, not cure, but then the reality is, if you look at some of these headlines, they don't even make sense, right? In February 2015, hepatitis C drugs are collapsing in terms of the rebates and the pricing and the competition, yet a year later, in April 2016, they're sitting there saying that this is the most expensive drug in America. And so the problem is in terms of the media and the distortion of facts, and the question is, how do you get those facts back into the market? Next slide. What's exciting in terms of hepatitis C is a little bit of the carrot and the stick, which again, a lot of rare disease and orphan drug companies have to face with, is in terms of threatening legal action, in terms of just outright denial of care and discrimination based on certain cohorts of patients, as well as then you look at the carrot and you look at certain health plans and certain initiatives that happened that, in the case of San Francisco, that said they're going to take a proactive view on this, and their goal is how do we eradicate hepatitis C in San Francisco, and this was as of a couple weeks ago. And now when we look specifically around access to care, I'll go through these slides pretty quickly. You know, we looked at the non-start trend, and as you can see, it's gone from 27% to 37%. And again, with real-world evidence, what you can do is cut through kind of the noise factor, because what was widely known or accepted or believed in the U.S. was that we were treating all the F3, F4 patients, which means they're cirrhotic patients, and we're just not treating the early stage, even though that sounds incredibly egregious, and the fact that we wouldn't turn away a stage 1 or stage 2 breast cancer patient and tell them to come back when they're stage 3 or stage 4, for some reason it seemed to be acceptable to impose those restrictions in hepatitis C. Nevertheless, the perception was that we were treating F3, F4. When we start to break it down by type of payer, and you can see the N sizes as well as the trend, if I focus just on the cirrhotic patients in hepatitis C and commercial, It went from 21% to 36% between October 2015 and September 2016, which is a dramatic increase, as well as obviously you see almost a 40% denial in F0 to F2. Going to the next payer is you look at Medicare, and Medicare actually was the best out of the three, but again, you're seeing still almost a 10 to 13 or a 13% denial in terms of F3 to F4 patients. And the worst is if you go to Medicaid, which is the next slide, and you see that it's completely egregious in the fact that F0 to F2 patients have almost, 2/3 of the patients are denied access, as well as a third of the patients that are F3 or cirrhotic were denied access. And just so you guys understand in terms of the proper context and perspective is, this information was not available through any other firm. Trio Health was the only company that we're aware of that's collected this data and now have published this data, and we've now created a massive discussion amongst Medicaid, CMS that manages Medicare and Medicaid, as well as the commercial payers around this denial rate, because they wanted to obviously keep it under the rug and not have people understand in terms of what's going on in hepatitis C. You can go to the next slide. And so our goal is, with real-world evidence, was to turn around and say that there's nowhere to hide. And with empirical data, it becomes incredibly powerful. And so when we started to look at Medicaid and looked at our distribution of our sample relative to Medicaid, and if I pick on Ohio, for example, they imposed a whole bunch of restrictions, and what you don't know behind the scenes, if you go look at the P&T committee, they turn around and say that a hepatitis C patient to be eligible has to go through 6 months of psychiatric evaluation, has a whole bunch of different hurdles and a whole bunch of crazy things that they have to do before they can get approved to be treated for hepatitis C. And as witnessed, 178 patients in Ohio tried that a doctor wrote the script, faxed it to the pharmacy, was hoping to get cured of their hepatitis C with a 95% chance, because that's what the cure rate is. And in reality, only 3% of those patients were eligible and allowed to start therapy. So again, having this empirical data and then advocating on behalf of the patient and understanding this becomes very powerful, because now there's essentially nowhere to hide. And again, as you guys think about real-world evidence as it relates to PWS, you should think of it in terms of two different perspectives. One is, what is the clinical evidence that could be incredibly powerful for you guys to collect through a scientific steering committee that will give you additional credibility, awareness, and clout. And then point number two is, from a patient perspective, what is the data that would be insightful and helpful from a patient-reported outcomes and quality of life, and how do you track that, and then how do you turn around and report that? As well as then if there's any type of discrimination or problems around co-pays, access to drugs, or supportive care therapies for your patients, in terms of thinking about it holistically. And that, again, is just a quick summary in terms of the way we think about real-world evidence and real-world data, and how we take that data and advocate on behalf of the patients within each disease state. So I will turn it over to the next speaker or questions that anyone may have.
Perfect. That's a great lead-in to what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to just present a very high-level summary of some of the things that we talked about at the in-person workshop. So as I mentioned, a lot of these presentations were part of an in-person workshop in Rhode Island, and in addition to a couple of other panelists. And after those presentations, we had breakout sessions where we had roundtable discussions, where each roundtable included a diverse group of stakeholders representing the full community, everything from parents, actual PWS patients themselves, group home workers, clinicians, researchers, members of pharma. And there were, we had about an hour or so to have facilitated discussions around a specific set of questions, just like what Brent was mentioning, with regards to, now that you know a little bit about what real-world data is, what real-world evidence is, are there some high-priority questions, research questions, tools that would be most valuable with regards to applying this type of research into PWS? Are there specific questions that are of highest priority, ways that it can help us understand the effectiveness and availability of current medications and supplements? Some of the other questions were how can we use real-world data approaches to help us understand variability across the spectrum of PWS. And then importantly, as we start designing some of these potential applications, devices, wearable devices, apps, or start asking questions with what's available in electronic health records and insurance records, what are the challenges and hurdles that we need to be aware of that are specific to the PWS population that we need to make sure that we're taking those into consideration as we develop these tools. And then, as we all know, we have really fortunate in our community to have a number of clinical trials underway. And are there ways that we could incorporate real-world data research tools into the clinical trial process to help strengthen and improve that process? So a couple of things that came out of those discussions. Again, in the interest of time, we're not able to sort of highlight everything that came out of all of those tables over that 1 hour. But some sort of key trends that came out of summarizing all of those discussions was that there's a lot of interest in collecting data that will help us develop a better understanding of natural history. Another way of saying that would be the story of PWS. If you go back to the image that Chris showed, you know, if each particular person in PWS is a piece of a painting, all of us together would tell the entire story of the painting. Are there devices or ways that we can use real-world data to help track and improve health and behavior at home, that we can measure effectiveness of potential interventions? There's also a lot of interest into the data that will help us develop consistent measures for some of the things that we want to track in PWS, so that we're all measuring things the same way, so that the data that's collected in Europe and in the United States, or within 2 different households in the United States, would all be comparable. It could all be included in the same statistical analysis. And then, as building on what Brent was just mentioning, looking at data that would be useful in improving insurance coverage and public services. And one of the things that really came to the forefront was with regards to growth hormone therapy, because that is one of the few therapies that is out and approved for PWS. Is there a way that we can look through the information that's out there to go from anecdotal evidence to actual hard scientific evidence regarding frequency of denial, the appeals process on a yearly basis, or are people changing brands of growth hormone due to coverage? There was some question about whether or not people are fulfilling prescriptions out of their own state. A lot of anecdotal evidence that we could potentially start looking at. With regards to specific questions and developing particular devices or software applications, the conversations were very interested in trying to correlate different aspects of PWS together. So not only tracking sleep or only tracking behavior, but is there a way to track both, so that then you can make a correlation between how is sleep impacting behavior, or how is hunger or food-related thoughts affecting behavior? How are any of these things related to biometric measures like sweating or heart rate or exercise, things along those lines? So it was very interesting to see how, what a high level the workshop participants were thinking about, and not just isolating any one particular aspect of PWS into a single box, but really trying to look at the interconnectivity and relationship among the various different aspects of PWS. With regards to some examples, again, ways that we could manage medication doses and compliant side effects at home. There was a lot of interest in an app or something along those lines that might be able to track a GI health, frequency of hydration, things along those lines. And then another one that came up, which was interesting, was a way to more quantitatively evaluate speech in a way that would, again, be consistent and remove subjective evaluation of speech and effectiveness of speech therapy again, this came back to the concerns over being denied coverage because of subjectivity in evaluation of speech. Quickly, with regards to some concerns, feasibility concerns, the group in Rhode Island was very aware of making sure that anything that is developed with regard to a device or an app would be easily used across socioeconomic, ethnic, and cultural boundaries so that it could be benefit the entire PWS community. There's some question about the reliability of PWS patients as self-reporters, being well aware that there may be some hurdles regarding collecting data in multiple settings, that you've got people that are at home, school, work, different environments throughout the day, and as well as some issues with regards to compliance, especially if we're talking about a wearable device. What are the challenges and ways that we can help promote compliance with a wearable device. So that's kind of a summary of some of the discussions that came out of the roundtables in Rhode Island. In the 5-10 minutes that we have left in this webinar, we wanted to provide an opportunity for any of you that are on the webinar today to add into that. Are there, of the research questions that were discussed, what are your opinions on what's highest priority? Are there things that are missing? Are there feasibility concerns that are missing that we haven't considered? And all of this information is going to be key to making sure that as we broach this idea of going into real-world data, that we're really getting perspective and input from the PWS community to make sure that we're asking the questions that are most important and that we're designing tools that are usable. And the community input is a key component of making sure that aspect of it is successful. So Teresa, I'm going to go ahead and unmute all of the attendees, or sorry, all of the panelists, and we'll see if any questions or chat questions come in. If you have any questions or information you'd like to add as a participant, please go ahead and type them into the chat or the question box. Teresa, you're unmuted if there's anything you'd like to add as well.
Well, I just want to thank our presenters today. I think, I mean, both presentations were great. I think, Brent, it was really interesting to see the data on the hepatitis C treatment. I think we've all, as parents, have had the experience. Growth hormone is quite expensive for our children, and we suspect that insurance companies often throw up barriers, not, I mean, if you're cynical or maybe realistic about it, not so much to protect our kids, but to slow down the process of getting approval and delays and, having to switch medications and things like that. And there's always or often a lag time. So to see that how using medical records can really demonstrate where the roadblocks are and essentially not give people a place to hide or payers a place to hide, I think is really attractive, because I think we know growth hormone is effective in PWS, and we want every family who decides to use that therapy to be able to access it most effectively. And we know that's not happening just because we sit around and talk about, the different barriers that insurance companies will put up to, having to get a prescription and then get a prior authorization each year. And then there's, there's a lag here or a lag there, and the end result is you're not getting continuous coverage. So I appreciated the power of that approach for looking at that one. That's one particular question I think that is, to me, would be a priority. And I don't know if others might have other ideas about how we could use the medical records for that. But thank you for that illustration.
We have a question in here. What are the effects, or how do we consider the effects of supplements and therapies on obtaining accurate real-world data? seeing a lot of PWS families that are trying anything and everything that might have possibly worked anecdotally for somebody else and their own children, and how can we account for that in collecting real-world data? So I guess that falls under that would fall into the category of hurdles and challenges that we might need to consider.
I think that's a great question, because I think, that's not going to be in your medical records, so it's a little bit less accessible, I guess. So I guess it would rely, maybe Chris can comment on having some way of tracking that so people have that data in addition to whatever other data they need.
Yeah, it was just Jessica, it was hard to hear the beginning part of what you said, the beginning, their anecdotal experience, right?
Right. So what they were asking about is what are the, the complication of potential supplements or other, any and every therapy that anyone has ever tried that has anecdotally helped, their particular child. If a family is using a dozen of those or even just 2 or 3 of those, how is that going to potentially impact real-world data collecting that you may be trying to do with regard to a specific therapy that you're trying to study?
Yeah, no, it's a great example of like all the different, variables that could come into play here. And, the way I would think about that is having you all involved, right? Getting the community involved to try and talk through some of those, and then maybe start collecting data on a set of them or all of them, and start trying to see where the data would show us which ones might be part of the picture, or which ones are not having some effect in across the board. So yeah, it's a really good question, and I think you would want to try and develop it so that the data would start telling you which ones are having effects or not, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Right.
You guys are more the disease experts than me, but I think what I would advocate is, is having the community involved in those design questions so that you can put that into the picture, right?
Right, and I would add into that as well the Global PWS Registry, which collects a lot of, there's a lot of opportunity within the registry to provide information on what supplements somebody's taking, what therapies they are trying, what are the benefits that they think that they are seeing or not seeing from each of those potential therapies. And the more we can gain a better idea of what people in the community are trying, how many people are trying it, and how many people are seeing benefit, what level of benefit, is going to give us a much better idea of which of those are ones that we need to consider as confounding factors as we venture into this type of research. So I'm looking here, Teresa. I don't see any other questions on here right now.
Right, and I think we'll have, Jessica, am I correct that we'll have an opportunity? We're going to send out a brief survey and request for feedback. So if people can, be mulling over these ideas as they look at their child with PWS, like what data would you want to be collecting and how? We'll send out a brief survey and would really appreciate your input into how we can use some of these devices, these apps, and our electronic health records to improve the care of the person with PWS.
Correct. And we'll also have this webinar available as a recording on the website, in addition to a broader summary of the conversations that we took place at the in-person workshop as well. So we'll have all of that available to everybody, including to researchers that will hopefully begin the process of developing some of these tools for our community, which will be a valuable resource for them. So with that, we will close the webinar. We want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And again, thank you to our presenters. We very much appreciate your time and your expertise. expertise in sharing all this information with us. And we wish you all a great week.
Thank you, everybody.